Hello and welcome to the second session in our Christianity Explored course. My name is John. In this session, we're going to be asking the question, who is Jesus? Yeah? Who is Jesus? Some of you may have thought about this before. You may have questions. But maybe for some of us, we just aren't sure who Jesus is. And we don't really know why he matters. Now, in your life, you may have heard of Jesus being spoken about in a number of different ways. There is the Jesus who is simply a good teacher, one who was wise, well thought of, and preached a message of love. Then there is the Jesus of history documentaries on TV, who lived on the earth 2,000 years ago and caused a bit of a political and a religious stir. And then there's also the Jesus of other religions, such as Islam and Jehovah's Witnesses, where he is seen to be an important figure and a great prophet, but any claims of him being God are quickly dismissed. Now, in all of these descriptions of Jesus, he is given many credentials, many accolades, and much praise. But the question is that really all Jesus is? Is that all he is? Is Jesus simply a good teacher, a historical name, or a prominent religious figure? Or is Jesus something far more important, something far more life-changing? A few years ago, I remember the time when I was about to meet my wife's dad for the first time. Now, I'd heard a few different stories from my wife about what he was like and the things that he did and what to expect. And one of the things that I found out was that he used to be in the army, which for any young man meeting his future wife's dad is enough to make them just a little bit apprehensive. So before I'd ever met him, I'd formed an impression of what he was like based on the few things I'd been told. I thought I knew him. But when I actually did meet him, when I spent time with him and got to witness what he was like, I was able to appreciate him for who he truly was. I got to build a proper impression of him and saw that he wasn't the scary, stern army dad that I was anticipating. Perhaps this is how many of us have formed an impression about who Jesus is. We've heard some secondhand stories or read some facts about him over the years without actually engaging with him for ourselves. So today, briefly from Mark's Gospel, we're going to let the historical, the eyewitness accounts of what Jesus actually did and what he actually said when he was on earth to shine a light on his true identity. We're going to look at 4 pieces of evidence and see how Jesus has power and authority like no other, and that he really is more than anything we've described him as so far. If you can, why don't you open up the online version of Mark's Gospel? Tom will share the link in the Zoom chat for us. This way you can follow along for yourselves if you'd like to. Now, the big number at the top is the chapter, and the little numbers in the text, they are the verses. So let's get going and let's see what Mark says about who Jesus really is. So in our first block of evidence, we see Jesus having power and authority over nature. Jesus and his followers, they're in a boat on the Lake of Galilee, and this is what happens in chapter 4, verses 37 to 39. So if you'd like to follow along, go ahead, chapter 4, starting in verse 37. It says this: "A furious squall came up," which means a powerful windstorm, "and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm." Now here we have Jesus' disciples, many of whom who were experienced fishermen, who were used to handling a boat in difficult conditions. Yet here they were absolutely terrified of this storm. They were convinced that they were about to die. So in their panic, they wake Jesus up, who was somehow peacefully asleep during this storm, And the disciples, they scream at Jesus and accuse him of not caring. And what was Jesus' response? Well, he got up, he told the storm to stop, the waves to be still, and he probably just went back and finished off his nap. And the disciples, in complete awe and amazement, said this in verse 41 of chapter 4. Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Do you see what's happening here? The disciples, like many of us this evening, are grappling with the identity of Jesus. Now, our second block of evidence shows that Jesus has power and authority over sickness as well. And this, during our current climate with the coronavirus pandemic, is particularly striking. And one example of this, it comes in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 31. Turn there if you'd like to, and I'll read for us. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Now, here we see Jesus demonstrating absolute authority over sickness. And this is not an isolated incident either. Throughout the whole Gospel of Mark, Jesus is seen to heal many different people with many different physical and spiritual diseases. And if we're honest here, especially during this time, the power of Jesus over sickness speaks to our very deepest desires. Our desires for a cure to illness and for suffering to stop. If coronavirus has done anything, it has made all of us hyper aware of our health and of our well-being. Many of us at this time will have felt scared and worried over the health of our own bodies and the health of those around us that we love. And countries around the world, they have been spending all of their money, they've been pouring all of their resources into trying to find a cure or a vaccine for this virus. It's taking all of our collective efforts on Earth to try and bring this disease under some form of control. And that is right for us to do. Yet, do you see the difference in how Jesus combats illness? Jesus, he doesn't need any drugs, he doesn't need any help, he doesn't need any time. Instead, Jesus, when he was on earth, healed in an instant, with total power, with total control, and he showed compassion and a willingness to be with us in our struggles. You see, Jesus heals in a way that no man or woman on earth could ever come close to. And he left those around him amazed and saying that they've never seen anything like this. Now, next up, the disciples, they witnessed something even more astonishing. They witnessed Jesus have a power and authority over death. That's our third block of evidence about Jesus' identity, and it's in Mark chapter 5. And to set the scene to these verses, here we have a religious leader, a synagogue ruler named Jairus, who was powerless to help his young daughter who was dying. And we pick up the story in Mark chapter 5, verse 35. It says this: While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Now, let's just stop and think about this for a second. What kind of man is able to say to a grieving father whose daughter has just died, "Don't worry, just put your trust in me"? Now, that's either the voice of an utter madman who has no social skills and no empathy, or it is the voice of one who is completely confident of his own power. The story goes on from verse 38. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. As with our previous point about sickness, the truth that Jesus has total power and authority, even over death, is something that hits our hearts hard at this time. The coronavirus pandemic has caused much pain and has taken many lives. Our culture has never been so aware of its mortality, that death is something that we will all have to face one day. Maybe that's a fear that you've been reflecting on recently. Yet here we read that Jesus has total power even over our greatest fear, over our greatest physical enemy, death itself. Now, I appreciate that so far much of what has been said will have raised many questions, and maybe more questions than is actually answered. And that's okay, don't worry. We'll have plenty of time to discuss questions in a bit. Now, before we finish, there is one more thing that Jesus was shown to have power and authority over, something that was far more controversial. We see in Mark chapter 2, Jesus demonstrating his power and authority to forgive people's sins. Now, we're going to take a deeper look at sin next week, but I thought it would be helpful to mention it here. Jesus forgiving sins is the greatest way he shows his power and authority, and it certainly shocked everyone around him when he did so, with people asking, who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, do you remember earlier when I shared the story of when I was going to meet my wife's dad for the first time, and I formed an impression of him without actually meeting him myself? Well, today, in this session, we have thought about who Jesus really is. And to help us, we have looked at a few different events in Jesus' life and seen that they show us a man with total power and authority over nature, over sickness, over death, and even over the forgiveness of sins. Jesus, in his life, exerted power over things that for us seem so far out of our control. And the purpose of Jesus' miracles, it was not to show off his power. It wasn't to impress anyone. No. It was to reveal who he truly was. That he was God in the flesh. Right, we're going to go back into our discussion groups now, where you have time to discuss what you have heard and to ask any questions that you may have. And we'll come back together at 8:55 to finish up, and we'll make sure we're done by 9 o'clock.